Okay, this is a presentation on the moral issues involving the taking of life. So we'll talk about several different topics here quickly. After some general stuff on moral responsibility, we're going to talk about abortion, euthanasia, and war. These are all moral issues that involve the morality of taking of life. So this is a significant moral topic, and I just want to talk about some of the basic issues involved. Moral responsibility. These are the conditions for excusability. That is, if one of these conditions are met, then we're going to say this person is morally excused from the action that they did. We won't hold them morally responsible. So first, ignorance. If someone does something out of ignorance, then we generally not hold them morally responsible for it. An example would be something like this. A person accidentally bumps into you, and you think that you were shoved, but then you realize no, they didn't even know that you were there. It was just purely an accident. Then you're not going to hold them morally responsible. Or if it's something like maybe somebody has stolen all the speed limit signs on a particular stretch of highway, and you get pulled over because you're violating the speed limit, but when it turns out that there's no way for you to know what the speed limit was, then again, we're going to say you're not morally responsible for that action. Now, sometimes we will hold you morally responsible because the fact that you're ignorant is something that you were morally culpable for. So you could have looked, but you just chose not to, or you could have found out what the facts were, but you just didn't choose to. Or for instance, you're backing a car out of a parking spot, you hit somebody, well, you didn't realize you were there, but the reason you didn't realize that they were there is because you didn't look behind you and you were responsible for doing that. So that kind of ignorance is not a condition for excusability. The second condition is compulsion. You are compelled, you're forced to do it by someone else. And generally that's also considered to be a condition for excusability, but that condition only goes so far. We won't hold you responsible because somebody said, if you don't rob this store, then I will kill you. You end up robbing the store. Well, again, it's the person who made the threat against you that's responsible. But the law recognizes that in a case of murder, you can't use compulsion as a defense. Third condition are just unavoidable circumstances. There's no way that I could have not done this. Classic example there is when you're driving your car, you're obeying the speed limit, you're doing everything that you should, and someone steps out right in front of you, you hit that person. It was an unavoidable circumstance. There's no way you could have stopped in time. It just wasn't physically possible to stop the car in the distance required. Fourth condition is the lack of relevant ability or opportunity. Well, it turns out, let's say we find out that you see someone drowning in the ocean, and we find out that you didn't run out to save them, but we're going to think less of you as a moral person until we find out that you couldn't swim. So we didn't need two deaths rather than just one. So you didn't have the relevant ability here. Now, one question is, and this goes back to our topic of determinism and free will. Is free will required? So if the world is a deterministic world, does that mean that everyone is excusable? That's a complicated subject that's debated in ethics and metaphysics still today. Okay, our theories: utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. These are the major ethical theories that we've discussed, or at least the major ethical frameworks. How do these theories apply to the moral problems facing society? Well, here are the moral problems. punishment, abortion, euthanasia, war, and poverty. We've already talked about poverty, or if you weren't there and I messed up the recording, so I'm posting a handout online, that sort of detailed handout that covers those issues. So we talked about the various ways that different ethical theories talk about poverty, and from that we can look at the ways that they handle things in general. A deontologist is going to talk about rights and duties. A utilitarian will always discuss things in terms of how this affects happiness overall. And a virtue theorist will ask what are the relevant virtues that we need to consider in this situation. So I don't think we'll talk about punishment. We may get to that later. Today it's just going to be abortion, euthanasia, and war. Okay, first, abortion. For the deontologist, the primary issue will be rights. So, of course, for Kant, abortion is not going to be universalizable in the same way that suicide is not universalizable. Contemporary deontologists tend not to talk about universalizability. Instead, they focus on rights. Well, the two relevant parties here, whose rights are particularly important, are the rights of the mother and the rights of the fetus. A question, though, from the deontological perspective is the fetus something that can genuinely have rights? Now, if the fetus does have a right to life, then taking the life of the fetus unjustly will be tantamount to murder. So for a deontologist, abortion is wrong if it is, in fact, murder. Now we have to ask, what are the necessary conditions for murder? And now, there seem to be three. Murders have to be intentional. If it's not intentional, it was accidental or just a case of negligence, we don't generally classify it as murder, maybe manslaughter at best, but not murder. Of course, another necessary condition has to be killing. If there is no death, if nothing was killed, then there can't have been a murder. Can be an attempted murder without killing, but there can't be an actual murder without a killing. Third condition is that it be of a person. For example, you swat the fly, you're not murdering the fly, you are in fact killing the fly. But in order for it to be a murder, it has to be the killing of a person. So we've got three conditions: intentional killing of a person. So the big problem here comes down to personhood. What are the criteria for personhood? Is the fetus in fact a person? Well, here are criteria that are generally proposed. So consciousness is one, sentience, the ability to feel sensations, reasoning also. Third here is self-motivated activity. That is that can include moving around, not just being moved or moving because of let's say it's a muscle spasm, or it's just a behavioral response, but moving because you want to be in another place. Capacity to communicate. Also, the presence of self-concepts. Okay, does this thing regard itself as a self? Are they aware of themselves as selves? Well, the problem here, at least from a metaphysical viewpoint, is that it looks like the fetus has none of these qualities that we generally associate with personhood. Now, one response is that, well, the fetus at all stages of its development is not, I'm about to say that wrongly. It's not the case that the fetus at all stages of its development is a person, but the fetus has the property of being a potential person at all stages of its development. That's one move that the deontologist can make, but at least it appears that a problem with that move is that we generally don't give something or someone rights on the basis of a potential that they have a certain property. No, we give them the right because they have that property. For example, We don't give a child the right to vote because they're potentially an 18-year-old. No, we give 18-year-olds the right to vote because they are actually at least 18. Okay, utilitarianism. The utilitarian will always ask what creates the greatest balance of happiness over unhappiness. Now, then you have to ask, what are the considerations here? Well, the happiness, unhappiness that is primarily going to be applicable for the utilitarian will be the happiness and unhappiness of the mother. Okay, utilitarian is probably unlikely to consider the happiness over unhappiness of the fetus. Now, there is another approach, though, and I think that this approach has a lot to recommend, and that's the virtue theory approach. The virtue theorist asks, what would be the virtuous thing to do, regardless of rights, duties, happiness, so on? What does virtue require? And the stress here is on the importance of having the right attitude. Well, from a virtue theory perspective, we'd have to, we'll ask, are abortions morally significant? And the answer to that seems to be yes, clearly. The reason for that is because miscarriages are morally significant. And to show that, all we have to do is consider what's the proper response to a woman who's had a miscarriage. Well, it's not to treat it as if that was insignificant, right? You don't say to a woman who's just experienced a miscarriage, just get over it. It was nothing, right? Well, it's not the case that it was nothing, and it's a traumatic experience. So miscarriages are morally significant, which means the loss of pregnancy is morally significant. Okay, so what are the relevant virtues? Well, they may be courage, especially compassion, and probably charity. So the question to ask here is, how should we as a virtuous community respond? What does, and that's both the community in response to the mother who's in the situation, but also how should the virtuous person as a mother respond to pregnancy and the potential of the loss of a pregnancy? Well, rights are, in fact, irrelevant. That's one thing that we have to recognize. It's not that rights are not important, but rights are irrelevant to whether or not this is a virtuous act or a vicious act. Because a person can, in the exercising of a right, act viciously. That's obviously the case, right? If a person has a right to free speech, that doesn't mean that everything that they say is going to be virtuous speech. A person can act viciously even when they're exercising their rights. We've got to recognize that pregnancy is not like any other medical condition. And the reason for that is because there is a special relationship between the mother and the baby. It's not just like maybe excising a tumor or something like that. It's not the same relationship between the mother and the infant. Now, the status of the fetus, of course, is going to be relevant only to the extent that well-known biological facts are relevant. And that means it's really difficult to say, to talk about personhood at all stages. But having a wrong attitude about abortion is to have a wrong attitude about human life in general. And this comes from a philosopher whose name is Rosalind Hursthouse. She's got a famous article called Virtue, Ethics, and Abortion, or Virtue Theory and Abortion. Here's a quote from the paper. She says, "To disregard this fact about it, to think of abortion as nothing but the killing of something that does not matter, or as nothing but the exercise of some right or rights one has, or as the incidental means to some desirable state of affairs, is to do something callous and light-minded, the sort of thing that no virtuous and wise person would do." Okay, an advantage of thinking about abortion in those terms is that you don't have to settle the personhood question to really say something about the ethics of abortion. Okay, the next topic is euthanasia. Euthanasia comes from two Greek words, the eu part, eu, meaning good. The rest comes from a word thanatos, which means death. So euthanasia is about a good death. There are several types, and they come down to two distinctions. The first is between voluntary, non-voluntary, and involuntary. Voluntary euthanasia is, you can think of euthanasia as, in a sense, mercy killing. Voluntary euthanasia is doing that, is killing the patient when the patient has, causing the death of the patient. Let's say that doesn't sound as morally laden. Causing the death of the patient when the patient has expressed that as his or her wish. Voluntary euthanasia. You're doing what the patient wanted. Non-voluntary euthanasia is causing the death of the patient, but the patient has not been able to express a wish for that one way or the other. So, for instance, the patient may be in a coma and unable to express their desires. Involuntary euthanasia is doing this against the wishes of the patient. Okay, another distinction is active and passive. So you can think of active euthanasia as doing something, a positive action that causes the death of the patient. Passive euthanasia is not doing something, and that inaction leads to the death of the patient. Now, a question here between active and passive is, does that make a moral difference? Is there a moral difference between our actions and our failing to act? Okay, before I should go on, I should say these get combined, right? So you can have active voluntary, passive voluntary, active involuntary, passive involuntary. Then you could have active non-voluntary and passive non-voluntary. Now, obviously, the most morally problematic case is going to be active involuntary. You are actively doing something to cause the death of another human being who has expressed a desire not to have that done to them. The least problematic case is going to be passive voluntary, allowing the patient to die when that's what they have expressed a desire for. The non-voluntary cases are going to be a little bit more difficult. Active non-voluntary, probably going to be more on the problematic side. Passive non-voluntary may be more morally acceptable. Okay, so the passive active, sometimes that's captured in the sense of the distinction between killing and letting die. Is there a moral difference between acting and simply not acting? Actions and omissions. This will be either turning off the machine versus not hooking the person up in the first place. So notice that usually we'll talk about turning off the machine as an example of passive euthanasia. You are stopping life support, but that still involves a kind of action. Okay, we might say that killing is initiating a course of events that leads to death. Causing death, but allowing to die is simply not intervening in what the natural course of action would be, or just letting nature take its course. Okay, Philippa Foot has argued if killing and letting die were morally equal, then we would be just as guilty for the deaths of those we kill as those we fail to save. But we fail to save, let's say, people in Ethiopia that are starving. Okay, if it were the case that killing and letting die are morally equivalent, then our failing to send food to the people in Ethiopia is morally equivalent to sending them poisoned food. And she said that can't be the case. So killing and there has to be a difference between killing and letting die. Okay. Another distinction that's important here, I think, in addressing these issues, is a distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means. Traditionally, this was a concept introduced in Roman Catholicism to deal with surgery prior to anesthesia. So to refuse ordinary means of saving your life is tantamount to suicide, but refusing extraordinary means is not. Let's say that there's a real simple procedure that Okay, imagine the case that here's a person who's got a they have a problem with gangrene on a limb, and it's just barely starting. You just barely see an infection there. Well, all that needs to be done is a doctor just to clean that infection up. Okay, doesn't really require an operation. All it requires is just taking some kind of topical antibiotic or something and cleaning up that infection. Now, you don't have the right to refuse that. Okay, so that's ordinary means. But let's say it's an infection that's so bad it's going to require amputating the limb, but there's no anesthesia, so they just have to saw off your arm or your leg without giving you anything for it, so you're awake. And it's not unreasonable, the church decided, for you to refuse that. That was extraordinary means. Okay, well, now is it morally permissible for you to voluntarily express a will to die and not be treated? Well, it kind of depends on what that treatment is. So again, if it's just some simple little procedure, it's done all the time, it's got a near 100% success rate, maybe all it has to be is an outpatient surgery. But on the other hand, if the only way that we can treat you is some highly experimental cancer treatment that maybe only has a 15% success rate, then it seems like you're well within your rights to refuse that kind of treatment, even knowing that that's going to lead to your death. One thing that's relevant here is the distinction, is our questions ask about the quality of life and the quantity of life. So let's say it's going to be a very intensive, painful, and expensive treatment, but if it works, you're only going to get an extra 6 months of life. And maybe that 6 months is going to be spent in a great deal of pain. Then it seems like it's reasonable for you to be able to refuse the treatment. Okay, the doctrine of double effect says that if an action that is morally good has a bad side effect, it can be morally permissible to do the action if the bad side effect was not the intended consequence, even if you foresee that bad side effect will occur. Okay, here are the issues. Now, this distinction is originally found in Thomas Aquinas, and he was applying it to self-defense. So Aquinas says it is wrong to take the life of another human being. But what about those cases when you're acting in self-defense? And he said, here's the reason why it's not wrong in that case. It's still wrong to take the life of another human being. And you're acting wrongly when you intentionally take the life of another human being. But what you're really intending is to defend your own life. Now, you don't directly intend to take another human being, but you do realize that in your acting on your intention to defend your own life, you foresee that this will result in the death of another person. But that's okay, provided that their dying was not your direct intention. And the way to determine if it was your direct intention or not is to ask this: would I, if I could do this, save my own life, without taking the life of the other person, would I do that? And if the answer to that is yes, then you're not directly intending to take the life of the other person. All that is a foreseen bad consequence. Okay, so this is a distinction between intending death and foreseeing that death will occur. And where this usually comes up these days is in something called pyramid pain killing. That's when somebody is in a great deal of pain, they're in a terminal disease, and you can relieve their pain by, let's say, giving them a particular dosage of morphine. The problem, though, is that the body becomes accustomed to that dosage, so To keep relieving their pain, you have to keep increasing the dosage. Now, at a certain point, you're increasing that dosage is just going to shorten their life. So, now, is that wrong? Well, it's wrong if you were giving them the morphine for the intention of killing them, but you're giving them the morphine for the intention of relieving their pain. It's just a side effect of that. That's foreseen but unintended, that it will cause their death. So, according to the Vatican, pyramid pain killing is permissible because death is not intended. It's just the relief of pain that's intended. James Rachels has a classic argument on active versus passive euthanasia. Now, he doesn't really take a stand on the morality of either kind, but what he argues is that there's no intrinsic moral difference between the two. Here's some key points of his that you can find in this article. when under certain cases, when passive euthanasia is done, there is still a great deal of suffering, and if our intention is to relieve suffering, then certain kinds of passive euthanasia are just not going to achieve that, and that is allowing someone to die. What's often done in hospitals is that we will that the hospital will just cut off their food and water. If they're being fed through a feeding tube and given water through an IV. So now the person obviously could very well die starving to death and essentially dehydrating to death. So it seems like a great deal of suffering may well accompany those things. He gives another case of, and this is something that I really didn't know before I first read this article, that was common, but it's fairly common for, I guess, Down syndrome babies to be born with, let's say, an intestinal blockage. And that blockage can be fixed really easily with a very simple surgery. It's a very safe surgery. But what will often happen is that the parents won't want the disabled child, so they'll just refuse the surgery and allow the child to die. Okay, is this better than killing the child? Rachel's doesn't think so. It's not that killing the child would be good, it's just that this, although it's passive euthanasia, doesn't seem to be any morally better. Another example that he gives, and this can be pretty persuasive, is he considers two people, Smith and Jones. Now I can't remember which is which, so I'll use the names, but they may be backwards in the example. One person is, in both cases, the adult here is the uncle of a child who will inherit, let's say, a big fortune. Now, if the child dies, then this uncle is the next person in the line to inherit. Okay, so he says, imagine one person, we'll call him Smith, little boy's in the bathtub. Smith goes up to the bathroom to check on how he's doing, gets up there, realizes that if that child drowns, then he's going to inherit. So he takes his hand, puts it on the kid's head, holds the kid's head under the water, child drowns. What would we say about this person? He's morally reprehensible. Okay, he killed that child. Now he says, let's consider another person, exactly the same situation here. Jones is the uncle, though. And Jones doesn't kill the child. He simply allows the child to die. He goes up to the bathroom, checks on the kid. The kid has slid under the water, hit his head. All Jones has to do is to pick the child up out of the bathtub, save the child. Instead, he just thinks to himself, what an opportunity, and allows the child to die. What would we say of Jones? Well, we'd also say of Jones that he's morally reprehensible. Okay, well, any response here? Well, one response is that I don't think that Rachel's has successfully argued that there's no moral difference between killing and letting die. What he has successfully argued is that some cases of letting it die are just as morally reprehensible as killing. It doesn't follow from that that all cases of letting die are just as morally bad as killing. War. Well, as a Army chaplain, I know something about these ethical problems. The problem here with war is that we know if we engage in a war that innocent people will be killed or harmed. There's just no way of avoiding that. We've got an obligation to minimize it, but there's no way to avoid it. So given that we know that, then it must be the case that war has to be morally justified. Okay, three theories: just war theory, political realism, and pacifism. Let's start with the second first. Political realism is the view that moral concepts do not apply to states. War is sometimes justified. It's justified when it's in the best interest of the state, unjustified when it's not in the best interest of the state. Okay, I want to get that out of the way first because I think that it seems, or at least it's obvious to me, that from a Christian perspective, we can't hold political realism. Okay, so I think that from a Christian moral perspective, war is, it's obvious to me that states do have moral obligations, that states are moral agents and their actions are right or wrong. It's not simply in terms of self-interest. So that leaves two kinds of theories that a Christian can hold. One is pacifism, that both the pacifist and the just war theorists believe that moral concepts do apply to states. The pacifist believes that war is never justified, and a just war theory can believe that war is sometimes justified. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about just war theory. Just war theory basically has three parts. There is what's called the jus ad bellum. Those are the conditions that have to be met before we can justly have a war. Jus in bello are the conditions that must be met in fighting the war. Then jus post bellum are the conditions that must be met when we end the war. Okay, jus ad bellum. Here are six of the famous conditions. One is you must have a just cause. So the most common example of a just cause would be you're acting in self-defense because another nation has attacked you. Another just cause would be you're engaging this war to protect innocent people. May not be your own citizens, but maybe there's another defenseless state was attacked and you're acting in response to protect those people. Two is right intention. You can't just go to war for any reason that you want. If you do have a just cause, your intention for going to war has to be to satisfy that just cause. Three, proper authority, public declaration. That just means that it's not everybody in the state or anybody in the state that can declare war. Only the person has the proper authority. And that's going to be granted by whatever the legal framework of the state is. Four, last resort. This is important for just war theory. You can't just jump straight to war. It's got to be the case that you've tried everything else. Diplomatic means, whatever. War is so bad that it should be undertaken only as a last resort. Five, there must be a probability of success. So again, if you engage in war, innocent people are going to be killed or harmed. So therefore, you shouldn't engage in a war that you have no hope for winning. Okay, there must be some decent probability of success. Six is proportionality. Let's say another state violated your state's rights, or another nation violated the rights of your nation. Well, your response has to be proportional to whatever the original wrong was. So imagine that there's a border dispute between the U.S. and Canada, and Canada declares some small village on our northern border to be Canadian territory, well, that doesn't require a full-scale invasion of Canada. That would be out of proportion to the ROM. Use in bellow conditions. Okay, 3 important ones are: first, discrimination. As we fight the war, we're required to discriminate between, and discriminate here is not discriminate in a bad sense, but to recognize a difference between combatants and non-combatants. So a rule here says you can't target civilians. Comes from this discrimination principle. A rule that says, let's say, medical personnel and chaplains should be treated differently from other members of the military because they're non-combatants. Also a rule that says there are genuine military targets, and then there are things that can't be used as military targets: hospitals, schools, so on. Okay, the proportionality requirement says that the military force that you use has to be proportional to whatever the value of the target is. So if what you are trying to do is to, for example, let's say there's a small building that's being used to for the enemy to use to let's say stage missions out of. Well, all it takes to destroy that small building is maybe a tank round. It doesn't require carpet bombing the whole city. Okay, so that would be out of proportion. Third condition here that's important is what's called no means mala in se. That's Latin for evil in themselves. Some things, some ways of fighting wars may just be so bad, so morally bad, that they can never be used, even if it would help you maybe achieve your goal. So examples of means that are mala in se would be maybe biological weapons, rape as a means of fighting war. There's a controversy about nuclear weapons, but that might be well considered mala in se. Certain kinds of landmines you might consider mala in se. So examples, things like that. Okay, let's see, do I have anything? Oh, that's the last slide. So that's it. That's just some of the issues that are relevant when it comes to the morality of taking life under different circumstances. If you have any questions about any of that, or there's something in particular you'd like to talk about, just drop by my office. I have office hours from 2 to 4, Monday through Thursday. Be glad to talk to you about anything that comes up in the class.